Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Fidelis. Tonight, Lauren and I are going to be discussing NFP, which is everyone's favorite topic in the Catholic Church. As everyone knows, or should know, the Catholic Church does not permit the use of birth control. We are not supposed to do anything to artificially impede with procreation. So NFP is supposed to be the answer to that. And the good news is that scientific advances have made it to where NFP is better than ever before. There are all of these different methods. There's all of these different things that people can do. And yet there's still this big issue, and that's that the majority of Catholics don't use it. The majority of Catholics are using birth control still. So why is that? And what is it that is making people run away from NFP? And what can we do to fix that? That's what we're hoping to answer tonight. And we hope that you'll have some comments that you can join us. And the good news is that we've already done a little bit of crowdsourcing and asked some of our Catholic women peers what their thoughts are. So we're going to have a discussion about that, and we hope you'll join us. So Lauren, to start with, what would you say for you has been your biggest frustration with the way that NFP is marketed to Catholics, both those that are married and engaged?
Yeah, I would say, like, to summarize it, it is marketed as more unrealistic than it is, I think, in like several ways. I mean, one thing that always stood out to me before I was married is that the way everyone spoke about NFP, and I don't know if this is something that's like phasing out because this was a while ago now, but everyone said, oh, it's so good for your communication in your marriage, and it will, you guys will become so close. And I realize for certain personality types, like talking about cervical mucus might somehow bring people closer, but that was not the case for us. And NFP hasn't been like a horribly negative experience, but it's definitely been something that I've kind of learned on my own and just kind of filled in my husband on like what's up from month to month. And so I haven't really seen a lot of the communication benefits that were touted. Another thing that I think was emphasized is how much abstinence there is. I think a lot of people are trying to market NFP to couples that they're afraid may like use birth control. And so they say things like, oh yeah, there's only like a 24-hour window every month when you can really get pregnant. And the reality is that for most people, abstinence lasts anywhere from like a week to 2 weeks or much longer, depending on how long your cycle is. So, and if you have like a textbook cycle, you could still be having like half the cycle be abstinence. And I think that's just like underplayed a lot. So I'd say that was my frustration in the way it was marketed. Those were the two main things, but it's been really helpful to be able to talk to Catholic women and peers and kind of hear, okay, I'm not the only person that's having these frustrations. For some reason, our concerns don't seem to have necessarily translated into the way that NFP is being taught in pre-cana classes. And I have more thoughts on that for later, but it is good at least to know that we're not alone in our struggle with NFP.
One thing that I noticed, I've done both engaged encounter that satisfied my pre-cana requirements, and my husband and I have done marriage encounters. So NFP was talked about quite a bit there. And it seems like whenever there is a source from the church discussing it, it's very whitewashed. It's oh, it's so easy. It's really simple. And, couples that practice NFP have more sex than couples that don't. And, they have lower divorce rates and all of these great things. And it's so it's presented like a sales pitch, and I understand why they have to do that because of what we just said. Most Catholic women are using birth control. So I'm sure there's the thought that, well, we really have to sell this to people. But it sets you up for failure. It sets you up for frustration and disappointment because, you get into it and suddenly, your cycle isn't regular, or it is regular, and then you have a baby that you wanted because, like they point out, you can use NFP to try to get pregnant as well. So let's say you do that. You get pregnant, you have a baby, and now you have postpartum cycles to deal with, and everything is crazy. And now, you've got to kind of relearn this all over again, and you're having to be super careful because you don't want to get pregnant again a month after you just had a baby. And they don't warn you about any of that. They don't tell you about any of that. And I also seem to notice that maybe this is just my experience. It seems like the only method that was really promoted was the Creighton method. I didn't even know there were other methods for a long time. But there's all of these different methods that people can use. You can use the Marquette method or the symptothermal method or Billings or Creighton. And it seemed to me like they really pushed the cervical mucus one. I don't know why, but I noticed that was promoted a lot.
I think my experience was that symptothermal was really highly promoted. So that's interesting that you say Creighton, but I didn't really know that there were other methods besides symptothermal. And for various like physiological reasons, I can't do symptothermal. And so I actually found, like, doing my own, trying to figure out what's going to work for me before I got married, I found like a monitor. It wasn't the Clearblue monitor, but it was actually a monitor for avoiding pregnancy. And you had to have like a textbook cycle to use it, but it would give you like a green light or a red light depending on what was going on in your cycle. But I learned that it wasn't the most accurate thing, so I was really excited when I found Marquette and found that it was basically the same simple monitor method, but there was a protocol for using it to prevent pregnancy as an NFP method. So that was really exciting to me. And I actually didn't even know that Marquette method was a thing until I probably had 2 children, or maybe 3.
And one of the things that I will say that I've liked about doing NFP, I'm not trying to be only negative, is that it really did clue me in more about, my body and the way it works and my cycles, and that's been great. But then on the flip side, again, another thing they don't really warn you about is you sort of start to notice, at least in my case and from what I've heard from other women, that the times that you're fertile, that's when you tend to want it the most.
That's so true.
So if you're trying to avoid, that kind of presents a problem. And you get to phase 3 and it's like, great, well now we can have all the sex, which is, I think, even how they described it in one of my NFP classes that I took, was that they sat there and they were like, hey, after phase, when you get to phase 3, it's it's a free-for-all. But then it's like, well, you don't want it as much then. And there's a reason. It's because your body's like, get me pregnant. But if you can't get pregnant, there's not anything that NFP can do about that. That's not their fault. But it's just one of those things that would be nice to, don't sugarcoat everything. Like be honest. Tell us the truth. Like, this is what it's like, the good and the bad. You're going to understand more about your body. That's a good thing. Bad thing is that, hey, maybe the times that you're going to want to have sex the most are going to be the times that you can't. That's okay. It's not the end of the world. But no one really prepares you for that. There's no warning you about any possible downside to NFP. There's none.
I totally agree. Yeah, that's definitely been my experience. And for a while, when I was probably going through a bitter NFP phase, NFP sort of felt like this cruel joke where the only time that you want to have sex is when you can't. And so it was really demoralizing for a while. But I think one takeaway from that is that maybe when we're teaching NFP, not me personally, but the people who do teach NFP, maybe they could encourage men to be more involved in that way, like have them take a little bit of the charge, where if you're in a relationship where the woman is really doing the charting and monitoring and everything, maybe the man can know during the fertile period, it's my job to find ways for us to bond that will be enjoyable for both of us.
And what makes me concerned personally is that by sugarcoating NFP and by treating it as a sales pitch in so many of these classes for pre-cana or marriage encounter or whatever the case may be, by phrasing it the way they do, by pitching it the way that they do, when couples come along and they're using it, maybe they're excited at first, but then they start to run into, a snag or obstacles, or it's hard, or they get accidental pregnancies, what's going to happen then? They're going to be, you're blindsided, and it pushes them away from using NFP and it pushes them towards using birth control. And that's a problem.
There's definitely times when the thought of getting extremely overwhelming, and especially when you do have, maybe you get pregnant, NFP doesn't work for you for whatever reason, and you become pregnant when you're trying to avoid right after you had just had a baby or something. And then that baby's born, and it really does feel like you're going to lose your mind, like if you have another child. So yeah, that kind of just goes back to being honest about what NFP is from the get-go, because I think if we were more prepared for that reality, not just learn NFP really well so that those things don't happen as much, that's part of it, but if we were more prepared for the reality that there is a learning curve and that our bodies change after pregnancy and things like that, that would be really helpful. With that said, like, I think we're placing, in general, we tend to like place all the onus on whoever taught us the 5 minutes of NFP that we had at our engaged encounter or whatever. And the reality is that I think we as parents now are going to have to take a lot of burden on ourselves to make sure that our daughters understand from a really young age how their bodies work, because there's a huge burden, there's a huge learning curve when you get married as a Catholic to learn all this biology that most of us never were taught, like growing up. And so in addition to trying to learn the theological aspects of Humanae Vitae and why don't we, use contraception as Catholics, we're also having to learn all this biology that can be really overwhelming. And so I think we have to realize that the burden isn't just on the people who are teaching NFP to engaged people. It's on like us as parents to teach our kids how their bodies work, and then to introduce the theology of why this is the case while they're growing up, so that when they get to that engaged encounter and they get married, this doesn't hit them like a ton of bricks. Like I think it did for so many of us who wanted to be good practicing Catholics, but like just nobody prepared us for what that was going to entail.
So would you say along those lines, for parents who want to prepare their children well for NFP, would it be a good idea for not young girls, but teenage girls or young adults to begin practicing NFP even though they're not sexually active?
Yeah, I wish I would have done that. It would have taken out so much of the learning curve. I was engaged for like a little over 2 years, which is pretty long compared to most people. And so I had a little bit of extra time to try to sort of figure things out ahead of getting married. But even then, I still went into marriage like completely confused. So definitely, it would be great to teach teenage girls and young women more about their bodies. And really, it kind of just seems like something that we should have been doing all along. And I'm not quite sure why we didn't. Probably has something to do with like the sexual revolution, but I don't know. But we should.
Yeah, and I think that maybe some parents are possibly uncomfortable with it, that they think, kind of along the lines of the Gardasil vaccine. Hey, if we give our girls this vaccine, then that's going to give them, permission to go out and have lots of sex. Well, that's not the case. I wonder if there's some parents that worry about that, oh, well, if I teach my daughter to use NFP, then that's basically telling her, go have sex all you want. And that's not what you'd be doing.
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, you could approach it from a completely non-sexual, perspective too. Just like, you deserve to understand how your body works, so I'm going to teach you. It doesn't even have to do with trying to avoid conception or conceiving or anything at a young age.
And I will say for me, one thing that's been super frustrating is the difficulties in finding teachers. You're told, okay, well, you get this, little 5-minute presentation in your pre-cana course. Mm-hmm. And then after that, you're kind of on your own. And there are instructors out there, but there's not a lot, which is not mm-hmm. necessarily the fault of anyone. I mean, people have to be able to teach. Mm-hmm. Those people have to be available. Mm-hmm. But there's not a lot of instruction. I know for me, there's definitely some, not at the moment, but in the past, there have been financial difficulties. Like I haven't been able to afford to pay for an instructor or to buy supplies and charts mm-hmm. and stickers, so it's that's another deterrent, is that it makes it harder. And the only thing that keeps you going in that kind of situation is your own faith and saying, okay, well, I have to do this. What if someone's struggling though? What if you're struggling and you're sitting here thinking, well, I'm going to have to pay out of pocket to have this person teach me, and then I'm going to have to pay for all of these supplies, whether it's the monitor or the charts or whatever it is, when I can just go down to an OB and my insurance will pay for me to get an IUD placed in.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that's something I think a lot of people have struggled with. I know just following a couple of NFP forums, like cost and not being able to find an instructor are common burdens that people are facing. It seems like we need to come together and figure out better solutions for these things. I have seen like women who couldn't afford their sticks from their Marquette monitor. Like, it's great when you do have a community that's supporting each other, because other women will be like, oh, I have sticks and I just got pregnant. I'll send you all my, the sticks that I'm not going to need now or something. That's helpful. But a lot of people don't even know that there are communities out there to find support for people who are using NFP. And so there's a lot of work to be done still.
And that actually brings up a good point too, is that it seems like a lot of the NFP methods are not willing to come into the 21st century. They don't seem to really want to adapt with the times. Like, there's still no app. There's not an app for Creighton for you to do your charts, because for some reason it has to be done on paper. You can't use an app because that's bad for some reason, which makes no sense. Or Marquette, you go on their website and it's like a college student that put it together in 1994. It's just horrible. And meanwhile, there are Facebook groups that women can go to that can offer support and help and resources, but you don't know where to find them. And no one's willing to come in and make an app or put together these things. It's like, who's going to step up and do this? Because that would go a long way towards helping women to get more on board with using NFP also.
Yeah, I think there's probably, I'm guessing there's a lot of engaged people that are told about NFP, and then they go to do their own research and they Google the different methods and they see the websites and they're like, it's not that user friendly. You really have to have like a friend or get really lucky and find an instructor that you can meet in person to literally hold your hand and walk you through, like, this is step 1, this is step 2, this is step 3, this is how you do everything. Because like you said, there's not a user friendly app that you can just download. There's the FEM app, which is really good, but it's not associated with a specific method of NFP. So I kind of hope that is fleshed out more and promoted. I think it'll be helpful to people who are trying to avoid or trying to conceive. But FEM itself isn't like an official method of NFP in the church. So that's probably something that a lot of people aren't even being exposed to.
And here in the comments, we have Lisa, and she mentioned, for us, it's $75 a pop, and it was priced based on our income, which I don't want to say anything about her instructor personally, what kind of thing that they had worked out with their instructor. But I've seen that a lot of places where it says, oh, we're going to do something just by your income, which is fair. But are they taking into consideration other things? Like, say, are they taking into the cost of your bills, your living expenses? Or do they just say, oh, well, you make $60,000 a year, so this is how much we're going to charge you?
That's how Medicaid is, and that can be really frustrating because you can be in dire straits and be completely ineligible for assistance. It would be nice if NFP were seen as more of a mainstream method of spacing children or trying to achieve pregnancy, because then we might be able to use our HSA plans or our insurance or our government assistance or whatever to help pay for the cost. But I think I don't know about you, this is kind of branching off into something else, but it's related. But when a lot of us go to a typical OB, they think that NFP is the rhythm method. And it's not. But a lot of OBs themselves who specialize in this field aren't even aware that there is a non-hormonal, non-barrier method of achieving or avoiding pregnancy. And so it's not getting credence from the medical community. And I think that's probably what's stunting it from being able to incorporate into insurance reimbursement and whatnot.
And can you imagine how great that would be if we were able to have, the cost of your instructors or, your monitor, if that was paid for by your insurance, if you could go to your obstetrician and have them sit there and say, oh, well, this is how it works. This is how Creighton works. And you would think that this would be helpful.
That sounds like a dream. Yeah.
I mean, you really like knowing how your cycle works, knowing when your fertile times are, regardless of whether you're using NFP, even if you're, say, not a Catholic, those are still good things for people to know, so it really would be fantastic to have NFP be brought into the mainstream. And actually, since we're talking about, the why it's necessary to bring them to the mainstream, what would you say are the positive things about it, that the good things that have been the way it's been presented to all of us? Why do you think that more people need to use NFP besides just that we have to?
I think it speaks to how pro-science the church is, because for some reason, the message that women get from a lot of the scientific community is that your fertility is a disease, your body is broken, pregnancy is a bad thing usually. So you're too dumb to understand how to work with what you have. So let us just put something in you or give you a method that's going to just help you prevent or achieve pregnancy, depending on what your goal is. And along comes the church and says, well, actually, we believe in feminine genius and that women can understand what's going on with their bodies. And I think one of the big pros of NFP is how much it affirms the dignity of men and women. And how it's so interesting to me that the Catholic Church, is one of the first institutions that in modern history that has come along and encouraged the empowerment of women and the use of science when it comes to fertility. And so I love that about it. I just wish that was one of the messages that was communicated better when NFP was being marketed.
I know for me, it was nice to have an understanding of the way my cycle worked just by itself. I mean, nothing else put aside. I mean, even if I didn't have any issues with, pregnancy or whatever, like just knowing how your body works and that's sad really when you think about it, because you go through, all of these years of schooling, you see obstetricians and gynecologists, you see doctors, you take sex ed in high school, and there's no real explanation of how your body works. There's none. No one sits there and explains to you really, other than, okay, well, this is why you have your period. There's no real in-depth understanding until I started learning NFP. And then I was able to have a better understanding of how my body worked and what was going on and what was happening. And that was really, I mean, if nothing else, it's interesting and it's helpful to know. And that would be one of the things that I would say that did bear out, that I was told when I initially was, in our pre-cana, when they gave these presentations, was explaining you're going to understand your body better. And that was absolutely true. And that would be really helpful to teach to women more, that this isn't just about sex. It's not just about, having babies or preventing babies. It's good to know how your body works and why, because let's say all of a sudden your cycle goes crazy. If you know the way your body works and all of a sudden your discharge is different, or you're getting all of these double peaks, or your cycle suddenly way longer, well, now okay, well, I need to go get it checked out. Whereas if you don't really understand what's going on with yourself, you may not catch those signs.
Yeah, or if you're on a hormone that might be giving you kind of like a fake cycle where you would never pick up on any change anyway, because it's not really what your body is doing naturally. Yeah, it's just bewildering that the narrative of I guess, I don't want to say the left, but people who support contraception and tend to oppose the Catholic Church. The narrative is that they're empowering women. But in my mind, they're withholding so much important information. I can't imagine how that is empowering to women. And so I really appreciate about NFP how much it's taught me about my body. And I agree that in high school, you just kind of get told why you get a period. But that didn't register for me. It didn't make sense, like outside the context of how your whole cycle works and how fertility works in general. So it really, I feel like it wasn't until I was in my 20s and like had really caught on to NFP, which was after I started having kids, that I was like, oh, okay, this finally makes sense. And there should be so much more of an effort to make sure that that has all clicked for people before they ever become sexually active, because it will save so much grief, I think.
And Kathleen commented that NFP reduces the complications that man-made manipulative chemicals bring about, which is another thing that women are not really told enough about. How often is anyone told, well, if you take the birth control pill, these are the risks? I've taken
pulmonary embolism. You could literally die.
For a long time. Well, I don't want to say a long time, but I did take birth control, you know, and I went through several methods. I've used the pill, I used the patch, you know, and no one tells you that, well, this is what you're risking. No one tells you that. They just say, oh, well, it's harmless. Here's the pills. Have at it.
True.
You know, it's and now the new thing is IUDs, which there was a time that I considered getting one. I didn't, but I did very strongly consider it. And I had heard all of these horror stories about things that can go wrong when you get an IUD implanted. This was about 3 years ago that I had this discussion with an OB. And I specifically asked them, you know, well, these are the things that I'm seeing. This is what I'm hearing. Is any of this accurate? And her answer was no. She's like, no, you know, the IUDs are really safe. Nothing really can go wrong. That was the old ones. You know, that doesn't happen anymore today. So women aren't being told really what the risks are when they're taking some kind of, you know, other kind of birth control method. And so it becomes not even an issue of, again, like say someone's not Catholic. Okay, well, if you want to take, you know, hormonal birth control or you want to have an IUD implanted, that's fine. But are you really aware of what the risks are? Are they telling you that? Is the doctor being upfront with you about that? And now that there's this big push for more natural everything, you know, natural childbirth and, you know, all of the natural products used in your home with no chemicals, you would think that more doctors would be on board with, hey, here is this method you can use at home that is natural and pretty much has no risks whatsoever.
Yeah.
But no one brings that up.
It's literally risk-free. Yeah, and the complications are real. I mean, even Vanity Fair, of all publications, did like they did a big expose on people who were having really bad complications from the NuvaRing. And the journalist sent some of her friends into a few Planned Parenthood clinics, and just she wanted her friends to see what the doctors told them about the risks in light of the fact that people have died of pulmonary embolisms shortly after going on the NuvaRing. And invariably, the Planned Parenthood practitioners told them that there were no risks, even when the patients divulged that they had a family history of conditions that would put them at high risk for complications with NuvaRing. And it just makes you wonder, why do physicians view it as more important to make sure that women are on birth control than to make sure that they're safe or at least well informed? You know, it speaks to something that seems very anti-woman to me.
Oh yeah, I mean, when we first got married, we didn't use NFP at first, but when I started getting more, you know, serious about, you know, my faith and coming, I don't want to say back to the church, but just, you know, taking it more seriously, we were discussing NFP and, you know, birth control, and I wasn't using birth control at the time, but I was sitting there thinking about it, and it just kind of had dawned on me that this is so misogynistic. It really is, because we're going to tell women, hey, you need to put yourself at risk for all of these complications to fix something that is not broken. Also that you can avoid having a child, because having a child is apparently a worse fate than, blood clots in your lungs.
Exactly.
Or an IUD, dislodging from your uterus and embedding into your abdominal, wall.
Yeah.
Having a baby is worse than that. It's better for you to risk those things than it is, to have a baby. Which, not to say that it's bad not to want to have a baby. I don't want to have any more babies. But the point is that when you look at you're balancing, the risks there, there's this overarching attitude in society that, having an unwanted child is the worst fate that can befall you. And you should risk anything and everything to prevent that from happening. Well, I'm sorry, but no, I don't think that, taking these birth control methods that can literally harm me is worth the risk. I don't see it that way. And the people who really benefit here are men. And I hate to frame it like that, because I'm not like an anti-male type of person. I don't think men are literally sitting around actively thinking, well, I'm going to get my woman hooked on some birth control that's going to hurt her so that I can just, have sex for fun. I don't think men are sitting there thinking that, but they're the beneficiaries. They risk nothing and they gain everything, whereas women have to take on all of these risks so that they prevent their body from working the way it's supposed to. There's something that's just not quite right about that.
Yeah, it's anti-woman, but it's also anti-child. And I mean, you see that in that this idea that access to sex, I guess you would say, is more important than almost anything else, in the fact that the leading cause of death among pregnant women is homicide. Pregnancy and bringing a child into the world is really viewed as a negative by and large, outside of a really narrow set of perfect circumstances that in the real world never really manifest. I mean, how many people can really say that they planned every single one of their children and it arrived exactly when they planned it to, into the perfect ideal circumstances? That's not to say that trying to plan when you have your children is wrong by any means, but we have to acknowledge that we're trying to create circumstances that are never going to be perfect. And so the role that men play as fathers and as loving husbands needs to be promoted more, and men need to be encouraged and empowered. I do to stand up and say, yeah, my role is not just to access sex whenever I want. Like, that's not the greatest thing in life. The greatest thing is for me to be a hero by being more selfless, and I don't think that the birth control culture is really promoting that message at all.
Well, and that actually hits on another big point, is that there is this issue of abstinence. You can't get around it when it comes to NFP, because no matter what you do, no matter how regular your cycles are, you're going to have to be abstinent at some times, which for some people that may not be a problem, but we live in a culture that is very, if you want sex, you should have it whenever you want, as much as you want it. And like, it's literally described as a human right. That usually it's by, abortion advocates that want to sit there and say, you shouldn't ever counsel someone, well, if you don't want to have a baby, don't have sex, because it's a human right. You're infringing on their human rights. Well, sex isn't a human right, but that's the attitude. That's the culture we live in, is that you should be able to have sex whenever you want. And being abstinent is, just this horrible notion, because how dare someone have to be abstinent for a little while, especially if you might want it, which, like we discussed earlier, when you're fertile, if you're trying to avoid, that's usually when you're going to want it the most.
For sure.
So you're really kind of going to war against our entire culture when you're using NFP, which goes back to why, that support is needed so much, because you need to have people that can kind of help hold you up when you feel like you're getting beaten down.
Oh yeah, for sure. I can't tell you how many times sometimes NFP, you just, bop along for 2 years and you're totally fine and it's not a big deal. And then all of a sudden it's so hard and you need to talk to somebody. And it has just been a lifesaver for me to be able to talk to peers that are going through the same thing for a few minutes and then kind of feel better, just at least knowing I'm not the only person going through this struggle, or other people survived, you know, whatever it is that I am dealing with this whole NFP journey. I can't imagine trying to do it on my own. And it really is, I think you put it really well when you said that it's like going to war against the culture, because it's so countercultural. And people like to say that they're countercultural by doing so many different things, like being green and, you know, voting a certain way. But really, when it comes down to it, like being countercultural is in those really hard personal decisions, like eschewing birth control in favor of NFP.
Yeah, and you would think that that would make it a little bit cooler.
I think it's cool, but yeah, unfortunately, that's not the popular opinion.
One thing that, like we mentioned at the beginning of the video, we had kind of crowdsourced this topic, and one thing that, you know, one person had mentioned was that they liked that NFP at least promotes it as a couple's joint responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Because as, you know, we just talked about, when it comes to birth control with an IUD or, you know, birth control pills, it all falls on the woman's shoulders. So with NFP, a positive, so that again, we're not just constantly bagging on NFP this whole video, it's something that the couple is supposed to do together. That may not always happen, but that's the way it's supposed to be, is that you're working together, either to get pregnant or prevent a pregnancy, or even if you're just kind of trying to whatever, you know what's going on with your cycles. You're supposed to be doing it together. So that's a big positive for some of the women that we talk to.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, not everyone is going to necessarily chart together. I mean, that just, the woman might not want that and the man might not want that, but the man definitely is supposed to play a role, and it does take so much of the burden off. And I think how that plays out is going to be different in every marriage based on what two personalities got together and got married. But that's definitely something that is promoted, I think, among people who promote NFP and teach NFP, is that the man is supposed to have a role here, and you do kind of over time figure out what that is.
Another comment that I thought was interesting from some of the people that we talked to was this notion that there aren't a lot of people that use NFP, which is true, because like we mentioned, I think it's something like 80% of Catholics use birth control. So most people do not use NFP. That's a fact. We know that. But she said that it was almost like you had to be kind of quiet about it, you know, like it was almost hushed, you know, like the instructors talked about it, but outside of that, no one really talked about using NFP. It kind of had to be quiet. No one knew about it. Have you had that kind of experience in your own parish, in your own life?
Yes, and I will say it's kind of a automatic litmus test for new friends that I meet, because I tend to like be kind of an open book. And if somebody gets super weirded out by me talking about NFP or something, then I typically know that that's not a friendship that's going to work out. And so I kind of have just taken the burden on myself to make sure that I'm not experiencing like alienation by doing it, by talking about NFP and whatnot with my peers. But you definitely do get those people that look at you like you have two heads when the subject comes up.
Which is so strange, because you would think, at least in the Catholic Church, even if people aren't using it themselves, they would be used to hearing about it. Which then brings up the question of, you know, well, are we in the church doing enough? Because if people aren't at least hearing about it, if it's uncomfortable to talk about, then there's a greater issue than just, well, it needs to be talked about more in pre-cana, or it needs to be, you know, more realistic when they tell you about it. You know, should our pastors be bringing it up? Should our pastors be telling their parishioners about it? Should there be more support in our parishes?
I think it would be a hard topic to broach in a homily, which, let's face it, that's the only time most people are hearing from a priest at all, just because people usually go to Sunday Mass, if that. So in my view, I think the only real solution is for us to be talking to our friends, and that might be uncomfortable for some people, but I think I can't see a super realistic way of getting the message out and normalizing NFP other than men and women just talking openly about it among their peers.
Well, I think you could put things in the bulletin about it. You can have pamphlets out at church. There's just having it to where it's in the forefront, where people see it and they're hearing about it, even if it's not necessarily the pastor saying, hey, are you using NFP? But just having it out there to where, at least if nothing else, people will see it and it'll be in the back of their mind, like, oh, there's this thing that exists. And maybe one day they'll be tempted to learn more about it, as opposed to it never being mentioned ever again.
Yeah, I can't say, and I might just be kind of desensitized since it's not really applicable. Like, I already have my method and I'm not really looking for a class, but I can't recall ever seeing a poster or a bulletin advertisement or anything for anything to do with NFP at my parish.
I don't think I have either. I mean, I could be wrong, but just off the top of my head, I don't remember that. Yeah,
and I know some parishes have usually it's just one person who teaches one method, but some parishes have a person that they'll refer you to if you inquire about NFP. And I know that typically that person is acquired because the teacher has gone to the parish and said, hi, can you make my information available to people who inquire about NFP? So I'm not sure that a very active role is being taken on the part of the church administration to make sure that that is covered.
Yeah, and that would probably make a big difference too, if they were actively seeking out instructors or saying, hey, we will help offset the cost. If you're struggling financially and you're a parishioner, we have this instructor, we will help you.
Yeah, it almost seems like it should be one of the church ministries, because you have the ministry fair, and that would be, if it were a ministry, that would be a way to help make sure that people's costs were covered if they couldn't afford their supplies or their instruction. It would be a place for instructors to volunteer their time, or at least teach a group class at a discounted rate if people can't afford one-on-one instruction, things like that. I don't think that I've ever seen an NFP ministry, but actually, if anyone sees this video and you do have one at your church, please comment, because we would love to learn more about it from you.
Another comment that we have here from someone that talking about NFP that I have definitely seen a lot of. As we talked about, there's a lot of NFP communities, especially on Facebook, that women can go to get support and resources, and those are great. But then on the flip side, you have the other issues of, some not so good advice and not so great support, and that's what this person was kind of alluding to when they said they wish there were more resources for women who needed to avoid, other than people saying, well, God will provide if you get pregnant. And let me just say, I hate that phrase.
Yeah.
That just sets my teeth on edge every time I hear it, because it's if that were the case, there would be no poor or starving children anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a helpful thing to say to someone at all.
No, not at all. There's a list of things that you see these articles going around, like things not to say to someone who's just had a miscarriage. That needs to go on the list of things not to say to people who are trying to use NFP to avoid achieving pregnancy.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I see somewhat frequently, which is really sad, is using NFP with a contraceptive mentality, which just, people were Catholic, we're allowed to not have all the babies. We're not supposed to be thuggers. It's okay. You're allowed to not get pregnant. But then there's this attitude where, and I think maybe you might be able to weigh in a little bit more on this, where they misconstrue the teachings on it because it says, grave reasons. Yeah. And I think people think that is meaning it literally has to be, almost life or death or something along those lines, that it cannot be something simpler than that.
Well, I think the bottom line is we have to acknowledge that there's a reason why the church does not have a list of what constitutes a grave reason. The church has lots of lists. The church has precepts. The church has 10 commandments. The church has canon law. Like, we totally know how to list things out when things need to be listed out. This is a case where a list is not appropriate. And the church, in her mercy and grace, knows that the graces that you received from the sacrament of marriage include the prudential judgment to discern prayerfully with your spouse together in your covenantal marriage when is a good time for you to seek to achieve a pregnancy and when it's not the best thing for your family. And trying to pontificate to other couples when they should or should not be trying to get pregnant is really antithetical to what the church teaches about NFP. And I find it so liberating to know that frankly, a little bit scary that the church trusts couples that much that they say you do need to have a grave reason to be closed to life, because our default posture is to be open to life, right? But if you have a grave reason, you don't have to be trying to achieve a pregnancy. You can try to avoid a pregnancy, but we're not going to go and write out a list of what those grave reasons are because we trust you to discern what that is.
Yeah, and when you need that community of people to support you, and then you hear these people say to you, you're using it with a contraceptive mentality, it's so hurtful. It's so hurtful, and it's not helpful, especially because, like we mentioned, there's not a whole lot of support you're going to get elsewhere, because a lot of these methods, like we said with Marquette and Creighton and so on, they're not really giving you a whole lot in the way of support and resources already. And so you think you find this group of people that you can lean on, and then someone comes out and says something like that to you. I mean, it really makes me want to take them and say, what were you thinking?
Yeah, I want to give the benefit of the doubt and think that it was either like a rote response that was memorized, because I know I've thrown around the term using NFP with a contraceptive mentality, and fortunately someone was like, no, that's not the case. Let me explain to you why that isn't a term that can be applied to NFP. And so I would hope that if people are using terms like that and saying that God will provide if you get pregnant, it's just not very well thought through. But you definitely do run into people that are very desperate to tell you what they think you should be doing with your fertility. And hopefully you can just tune them out, because it's not helpful. And I wish that people would realize that the lack of support is so serious that that's just not necessary or appropriate in those conversations.
Another thing that someone that I found interesting commented on about NFP was that they said, for something that is basically a biology lesson, it really irks me that the NFP community as a whole seems so resistant to the rest of biology, evolution, vaccines, etc. And she went on to talk about how, there's often a lot of conspiracy theories floating around the NFP community in regards to the medical field. And she also added that it's hard for the average doctor's office to take NFP users seriously because of that. They're ignoring basic biological practices, or they are super, super into, being anti-vaccines or anti-medicine, anti-science. And then on top of that, she had mentioned that her other point that it makes difficult for doctors to take them seriously is the super crunchy attachment parenting culture, quote unquote, is what she said, which This is not to say that people should not be attachment parents. That's not at all the point. You do you. You're an attachment parent, go for it. If you want to be a crunchy mama who wears your baby all the time and uses coconut oil, then, fantastic. But as this person said, stick to NFP, stop telling people how to raise their families. And that is something that I can say in my experience, I have seen quite a bit of in NFP communities, this insistence that you have to be very crunchy and attachment parenting, and there really is no place for that in NFP either. And I do agree that that could kind of push people away from wanting to use NFP.
Yeah. To be perfectly honest, that's why I'm not in any NFP groups. I just don't have the patience. I tend to commiserate about NFP with just Catholic friends in general, or people that I know like science, because I just don't have a lot of patience for being preached to about parenting in general or science denial, and things like that. But I can totally see how that kind of paints NFP users in general in a bad light, especially just because they're people who tend to be vocal about what they think about parenting styles and how other people parent wrong, and anti-science conspiracies. They just tend to be very vocal in general. And so I think it does do a little bit of a disservice to our public image. As a PR girl, I can say that. it hurts our public image.
Well, and even aside from the anti-science stuff that you see so frequently, the constant pressure in these NFP communities to push the attachment parenting, which again, attachment parenting, totally fine. Go for it if that's your thing. But when you go into these groups and that's all you see is not NFP support or advice, but people arguing about how attachment parenting is the only way that you can parent. You shouldn't ever let your kid cry it out or give them bottles or, put them in a stroller. Mm-hmm. When you have all of that going on, it presents this image that NFP is only for these crunchy parents. And you don't have to be a crunchy mom to use NFP. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be an attachment parenting, guru to say, well, I don't want to use birth control, I'm going to use NFP instead. The two are not linked, and they shouldn't be linked. It does a disservice. It pushes people away, and we shouldn't be doing that. We should be welcoming everyone, regardless of what kind of parenting outlook they have, or, if they prefer baby wearing or putting the baby in a stroller, like that. Mm-hmm. It has nothing to do with it, and it shouldn't be brought together.
No, I mean, especially not in a Catholic NFP conversation, because, not to be obvious, but Catholic means universal. And if we're not welcoming everybody who's trying to follow church teaching and have a conversation and support them and lift them up in their NFP journey, then it's really counterproductive.
So to close, since we've gone on for almost an hour.
Oh, wow, that was fast.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about NFP. I'm pretty sure we'll probably go on for a lot longer. What would you say, in your opinion, would be the best thing to help promote NFP and get more Catholic women to use it? What would you recommend?
Well, I don't see a way to fix it in one fell swoop, but starting young, teaching young girls about their fertility, talking to our peers more openly about NFP, and then at the actual pre-cana and marriage encounter or whatnot classes, just being really straightforward about what the downsides and the struggles are, as well as what the positives are. Don't try to overplay the positives or exaggerate how much non-abstinence that you'll get to have in a given month. I think that people appreciate transparency and honesty when they're considering, serious decisions about their fertility and anything else in life. And so we don't want to do them the disservice of misrepresenting what the church is offering.
For my part, I think that what would go a long way is really, really simple. And that is more technological offerings. Mm-hmm. Something as simple as an app could go so far to reaching so many women. There are cycle charting apps that you can find, that they're not NFP specific. Mm-hmm. And updated websites with resources just easily available, an app that you can just download on your phone, particularly one that's free.
Yeah.
And that would go so far to reaching out to people. It really would, because, there's plenty of women who do try to keep track of their cycles that aren't Catholic, that don't know a thing about NFP. And so just imagine you're browsing on your phone looking for an app and you come across the NFP app. And you're going to reach so many more people that way. I think that would make a difference.
And if people who watch this video, I don't know how many there will be, sometimes there's like 2 and sometimes there's like 200. So, but if people are watching this video, please, if you have recommendations for resources or technology that you found that's been helpful to you, maybe it's not branded as NFP, but can be used by people who practice NFP, we would love to hear about it, because we're 2 women of reproductive age trying to live our Catholic faith and practice NFP at the same time. We'd really appreciate it, and we could share it with the community as well.
So I think that's about it for us tonight. I thank everyone for tuning in and for leaving a lot of comments. I see there's some pretty good discussion going on.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so thank you for tuning in. We hope you will come back next week. And thank you for watching Fidelis, where there is no right way to be a Catholic woman.
I love that. All right. Like our page, share our video, and we will talk to you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.